Oh, this is funny. Oh, come on, start.
The broadcast is
There
now
we go.
starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Jeannie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Delivery Project PIs and Partners, we welcome you to the first webinar of our third fall series, titled Fire Effects on Vegetation and Soils in the Great Basin, Response and Site Characteristics, presented by Rick Miller from Oregon State University. Other webinars this fall include topics on seed zones, differences in rangeland drills, grazing, and possibly aerogamoth, and more. And I will post these webinars on the events section of our website as they are scheduled, and we'll also send them out as announcements to the listserv. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to let you know that you may ask questions at any time during this webinar by typing them into the questions pane of your control panel at the top right of your screen. I will field questions for Rick after the presentation, but if you have technical questions for me, I can respond at any time. I will show up as the Wildland Fire Lessons Learned Center. Now I would like to introduce our presenter. Richard Miller is a range and fire ecologist retired with Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon. He has worked with Great Basin ecosystems for over 30 years and is a partner on the Sage Step project. He has been working with us for the last year on bringing the fire effects information together in a useful way, and we are very appreciative of this effort. Welcome, Rick, and thank you for being here today.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, well, welcome everybody. The purpose of this webinar or seminar, let's see.
Sorry, I just switched you over to presenter.
Oh, you did, okay. So
yeah.
Do I need to click something here, show my screen?
Yes.
Okay, there we go.
All right, I see it.
Okay, are you sure? No, okay. Then I want to shrink this one down. Or what do you see? I see, maybe I can move this over.
Your,
okay.
I see your task, oh no, it disappeared. Okay.
Okay,
I think
are we
we're
good?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had to move some things around because I was still seeing parts of your stuff.
Okay.
Okay, well, we'll try this again here.
Okay.
This afternoon, what I plan on doing is I just kind of want to introduce this short book that will be coming out. It'll be available online and also through the Forest Rocky Mountain Research Station publication, so it will be available free for people in the field for classroom use. And so I'm going to introduce this book, just basically covering, what the objectives are of this book, how to use this book, and also then get into kind of what is the content and hit some of the highlights. And of course, the main focus is going to be on the effects of fire on vegetation and soils in the Great Basin region. The region that it covers, we stayed out of the Colorado Plateau because we're getting more into strong summer precip, so we tried to stay within what we call the Great Basin region, including the Snake River and Columbia River plateaus, and this is shown here on this map where you can see the different numbers which represent different MLRAs, such as 23 would be the high Mount Muir Plateau. The primary purpose of the book was to try to pull together and summarize all the literature that I could find, and I actually ended up summarizing some 400 papers that were focused primarily in this Great Basin region. Occasionally I went out if I thought it was applicable, but I tried to stay within the region that I defined, and pulling all this information together and trying also to come up with terms of what do we know and what do we not know. And the second component of this, or purpose of this book, was to really sort out the role of site characteristics, because it can get quite confusing when we try to go through the literature and try to figure out, well, why does this one seem to contradict another paper. The role of these site characteristics really enabled us to sort out the responses when I was going through all these papers and trying to determine why did they see this particular response on this paper and yet it was very different than something else. And this becomes very important when it comes down to really looking at literature or even interpreting what we see on different sites. This kind of came from there was an older publication that did a summary of literature, and their conclusions were, well, when we look at the fire literature in the Great Basin region, some of the papers say it does good stuff, some of the papers say it really does bad stuff, and some of the papers it doesn't make much difference. And so their conclusion was is that we really don't know much about fire. And so we've seen both these where we can see conditions like this thinking, well, we got a very good herbaceous response from the native understory, or we see sites like this where we did not get a response that we had hoped for. So many of you probably have seen this figure before, and a lot of this is kind of based on this type of framework. So we tried to couch the review of the literature in terms of addressing these kinds of questions, that looking at the ability of these sites to recover and the resistance of these sites to invasive species, and the key components such as the ecological site characteristics or the current vegetation, or how severe was the fire, or what's the role of pre and post weather conditions. And so we really tried to couch it in terms of this framework, because again, this really then enables me, when I was reading the literature, to say, well, these were very different ecological site characteristics from paper A versus paper B, or if you're out and looking at a couple of treatments and some look good and some look bad, couching it and really focusing on some of these primary components really helps to interpret what you're seeing, or possibly looking at a site and being able to predict what the outcome will be if you do a prescribed burn on that site. And if you get into looking at the factors, I think the real key components are going to be really evaluating resilience and resistance on these sites. And we're fortunate that a lot of the ecological site characteristics that are currently being mapped really help us determine some of the key components in this site evaluation, and that really comes down, looking through the literature, it was very strongly linked to what the effect of moisture on that site was it a relatively dry or moist site, and what the soil temperature regimes were on that site, which is a gradient, but going from warm to cool to cold, and definitely the composition of vegetation on that site prior to burning were all extremely very important in terms of what was likely to occur after an applied burn or a wildfire burn went through the area. And of course, another ringer in here is the severity of the disturbance or fire severity. We might go into a situation where we have good condition vegetation and we have everything going for us with moisture and temperature, but we had a high severity fire, so we had a lot of mortality on what was there prior, and that will influence the recovery ability and the resistance of that site to invasive species. So when we went through all these papers to pull everything together, unfortunately, a lot of these papers, particularly a lot of the older ones, are kind of limited in the type of information they give you on the study area. And some were quite good and some were very vague. But I was always interested in terms of where the study was done, so I knew what major land resource area, MLRA, that site was located in. Usually they would give an elevation. Generally, I would get precipitation, about what they thought average precip would be on the site, but sometimes not. And from knowing, if I knew elevation, the MLRA, and the precip, you can pretty much probably, you could put it into a soil moisture temperature regime in terms of, is this a warm site, or it would be mapped as a mesic, or is this a frigid site, which we would call cool, or is it a cryotic site, which would be cold? And are we less than 10, are we 10 to 12, or are we more in the 12 to 14? Because these all have a huge difference or effect on the recovery potential of these sites. And then try to figure, if I could, from the literature, were these sites degraded, or were they in relatively good condition when they applied the treatments, or when they were evaluating the wildfire that went through the area. These are all real helpful, not only when I'm going through the literature, or when you're going to be looking, if you're looking through the literature, but a question that arrives oftentimes as well. John Bates or myself, we did some work up on Steens and looking at juniper in response to burning, and Robin Tausch looked at some stuff down in central Nevada. Can we actually extrapolate or interpret and compare how well do these sites compare? Because I'll tell you that if Robin was working on a 4,000-foot elevation site, which is hard to do in the high central Nevada plateau, And where if we were working on a 4,000 foot site, the sites would be very, very different. But if we look at the site characteristics, for example, on the shot above the Steens picture here, those sites were in relatively good condition. We are on a basalt soils, very different than the calcareous soils that would be down in central Nevada, so we have a difference there. But they're both in about the same precip zone, probably 12 to 14. They're both on frigid soils, and they're both they were both in fairly good condition when these sites were burned. So the key thing here is, even though there are some differences of these sites, their resilience and their resistance to invasives would be very similar, so their recovery potential would be about the same. And so these were both mountain big sagebrush sites, and if we look at kind of this conceptual model of how resilience increases, work that Robin would do, and I don't know if you can see this arrow, but if we come right into the, say, the center of this graph, we could say that somewhere in the center of this graph in resilience is about where these two sites would be, even though the site in Nevada was 7,800 feet in elevation, and the site in the Steens is only 5,000 feet in elevation, but it was farther north. So those were key components that we found, and we tried to frame this literature review in terms of comparisons of knowing where you are, and different MLRAs have different criteria in terms of when you go from mesic to frigid soils, and those are going to be mapped, and those would be in the site descriptions. And so if you see a site description that says it's a mesic site and you're getting ready to burn it, you really need to be careful, because mesic sites are extremely have low resistance to invasive species, where those cool moist sites are going to be higher, and the cold sites will be even more so. And those will be, that information would be given, or you probably would know it also if you're familiar with your area. And of course, these will be modified by soils, and it'll be modified whether you're on a north aspect or a south aspect. We look at the uses of this book. We're hoping that it will be quite useful, and that one thing is it really helps pull together what we know and what we don't know. So hopefully kind of keep us out of trouble, that there's some things that we think might be true, but there's really no literature to support it. And or things that we might be stating that really are, well, sometimes it is or sometimes it's not. We're hoping that this is a very condensed set of literature, over 400 citations, that will make your jobs easier in terms of when you're writing EAs and management plans, that this would be like a desktop reference that you could pull off. And if you're interested in a specific topic in this on fire, you could pull it out. Or you could go to the reference section, and if you want more information, go to those papers that are cited. With the framework that we couched it in, looking at the key components and characteristics, and then looking at response, I think also it'll give some good information on, when going out, how do you evaluate the resilience of a site, and how resistant is this site likely to be to having invasive species moving in onto this location. It definitely, again, with this type of information, it really helps in terms of selecting the right sites and the right treatments for management, and which will increase success, and definitely also help to predict outcomes of what's likely to occur on these areas. Because when we're proposing management, we must have some idea what these sites are going to look like 5, 10, 20 years down the road, because we want to meet a specific set of objectives. And so that means we have some idea that if we apply fire or some type of fire surrogate treatment, we have some idea of how this site is going to respond. And the more information we have on the site characteristics, the better ability we have of predicting what those trajectories are likely to be. In terms of how to use, not having seen the printed version, which will be out soon, I don't really, it'll probably be fairly long, but it's broken out into subsections, and so we're looking at this as being basically a reference, not something to be read from cover to cover, and it doesn't need to be read from the beginning to the end to be able to understand what's going on. It can be picked up and look. There's major sections, which I'll explain here in just a minute, but there's subsections. So it would be easy to go to a specific subsection and, say, pull something out that refers to what is the fire impact on seed pools, or or looking at fire and grazing. And it's also then links with the framework that we've set up with the looking at the questions and the key components of how these sites respond. It hopefully will help take this literature and link it into management decisions and things that you're seeing on the ground. So again, it's not something meant to be read from one end to the next, but can be picked up and information can be pulled out of this in various subsections. So if we look at the contents of, there's basically, it's broken out into 6 or 5 sections, and then each section has subsections. So the first section basically sets kind of the stage of what the boundaries of the area are. This is a map of ecoregions that I know some of the, particularly I think BLM, I'm not sure about Forest Service, use quite a bit. It talks about which floristic provinces that are covered, and it also talks about that with this review and also the major land resource area units. Within this, then, the subsections would be things like what's the general geology and how does it change across this area, the soils, the vegetation, and the topography. It also gets into looking at the environmental gradients that occur across these areas, particularly as we go up in elevation or we have changes in aspect, that do result in some fairly predictable changes. We go up in elevation, it gets cooler, we get more precipitation. We know that a north slope is cooler than a south slope. And so with this, it really helps to kind of, it tries to tie together the environmental gradients that occur across this large region that we work within, and how that links to resilience, recovery ability of these sites, and also resistance to invasives. We also, we were asked to try to come up with what we could with climate change, since that's probably a very frustrating topic that a lot of you out there are trying to work with. And we pulled together everything that we could find, which wasn't a lot. But I think there's some things that there's no specific answers like this is what it's going to look like in 2050 and this is what it's going to be in 2075. But there are various scenarios and some different patterns or trends that are likely to occur. And one is going to be that we'll likely, if temperatures warm up, we know that that's going to be warmer and probably drier, at least just straight on temperature, regardless, say, if we keep moisture constant, that the resilience of sites are going to decline. And in other words, they're going to become more resistant, for one thing, less resistant to invasives. The mountain sage communities will move upslope, and we'll see probably a decrease in resilience. It just is going to happen when we see warmer temperatures or drier conditions, and we see that during drought periods. Resilience, ability of these areas to recover is going to decrease, and we're going to be dealing with more issues, higher elevation, that right now these sites are fairly resilient. What's kind of an interesting question is, in the Wyoming big sagebrush, if it becomes dry enough, cheatgrass may actually become more resistant to cheatgrass encroachment just because it'll be too dry. However, there could be some other species such as red brome or other annuals that then might actually be more adaptable to these Wyoming sage sites as they become warmer and possibly drier. The second section gets back into what I was mentioning, this framework. This is the only difference with this graph, which you saw earlier, is post-fire disturbance is another big factor. In linking the framework and kind of talking about the key components before we get into the actual heavy, the summarization of the literature. So again, it kind of helps us set up the framework of the ecological site characteristics and current vegetation, or post-fire disturbance, in terms of the kinds of responses that we picked up in the literature. Section 3 is the real guts of the book, and this is the literature citation that really gets into the effects of fire on plants and soils. And it's basically broken out into subsections such as shrubs. We broke it down into major cover groups: shrubs, perennial grasses. You can see this major cover groups that we broke out into. But we also do break it into species, and it's really a bit frustrating. There's some pretty good information on some of the major species, but the majority of species in the basin we have very little individual information on. So, for example, with perennial grasses, we also, besides covering them as a group, we also pulled out whatever we could find on blue bunch wheatgrass, Idaho fescue, some of the needle grasses. Of course, with shrubs, we have bitterbrush, the sagebrush group, and so we try to break these out into species. Some of the components that were quite interesting in doing this review is how consistent certain patterns were. For example, with looking at this graph, this is based on some of the sage step data, but it really reflects on what we found in 90% of the papers that we reviewed in the Great Basin region that focused on the on perennial grass component. 90% of the papers showed that in the first year after burning, there was a decrease in perennial grass cover. In the second year, there was generally about the same number, about 90% of those papers showed that they usually recovered to about pre-burn levels. And I can't remember, but I know it was well over the majority showed that by the third year they'd either recovered, or in this case they actually exceeded the control treatments of say, non-burned areas. And so this was an interesting pattern of not only a couple of papers did not show this decrease, they showed there was no change in that first year. So we didn't find a single paper that was published that showed there was a huge, this big increase in the first year. There was actually a lag, and it didn't occur until the second or third year. What was also interesting is we saw the same thing with the exotics. Oftentimes, when we burn, we think of the cheatgrass component really just exploding in the first year, but it was, again, 80 to 90% of the papers showed that in the first year, exotics were actually below pre-burn levels, or really hadn't changed. And you can see that in this one picture of one of our sites in 2007. This is the first year after pre-burn, and we had very little cheatgrass in 2007. But then if you look at it in its third year, you can see 2009 we have a huge component of cheat in the foreground. And that was a consistent pattern across the literature, that the exotics oftentimes decreased, and then in the first year, but then in the second and third year there was a huge increase. There was a large increase. Let me just say, usually there was an increase, and the increase was larger on the mechanical, or on the fire treatments, than they were on mechanical treatments. That was pretty consistent. The other thing that was very consistent is the magnitude of increase between what we would call these warm, dry sites, or they would be mapped as mesic, aeritic, versus sites that would be, and those would be, for example, Wyoming big sagebrush communities generally. And the ones in blue would be mountain big sage, oftentimes mapped with as frigid, or we would say cool soils that are moist, usually 12 inches or more precip. You can see they were consistently lower in the cheatgrass or exotic component, and the response, even though they did increase, the response was considerably less than it was on those warmer sites. And that was supported throughout the literature. The other thing that we tried to pull together everything we could find in the region was basically the morphology, because as I mentioned, species response, we have good information on some of the major grass species, but it's really surprising. There's a lot of species we have very little information. So then you have to really get down into looking at the morphology of those grasses, such as that the fine needle grasses tend to be less tolerant to fire than the broadleaf grasses, or the morphology of perennial forbs, in terms of, you can look at the morphology and just based on certain characteristics, be able to evaluate that this forb, because its growing points are below the soil surface, are going to be more tolerant to burning than those that have the buds near the soil surface or just above the soil surface. So we often have to go to morphological characteristics to evaluate the kind of response that we think will occur. Other subsections are the extreme importance of pre-fire composition. That was just huge. It consistently came out that what you have before the fire is oftentimes what you're going to get. Of course, that can be impacted by fire severity. There's a section on what role seed banks play and what impact fire has on soiled seed banks. There's a section on post-fire grazing. There's not a lot of information, but there are a handful of pretty good papers that give us some insight on the effects of grazing, how soon can you go in on these areas, and what's been found out. And again, there's some science involved, but there's a lot of art because it gets down to the characteristics like we mentioned earlier, the resilience of those sites, the resistance to invasives, and the condition of that site, and how quickly it comes back after fire. And then we also looked at fire versus fire surrogates, such as some mulching, but mostly cutting, hydrax, using mechanical treatments, and how they compare to fire. There's a fire severity. We also have a section on, and there's a table. This is just a very small portion of a table that's just used to kind of give you an example, but oftentimes when we go to a site, we don't have it instrumented to know, well, how hot did the fire get and how far down did those soil temperatures possibly cause severe conditions that would influence microorganisms or roots. And there are certain things that we can go out and look at immediately after the fire that can give us a pretty good handle on, was this a relatively low severity, moderate severity, or high severity fire. For example, in the photograph here, this would go right into high severity fire because we have nothing but sage-rust stumps. In a lot of cases, the sage-rust stumps you can't see because they were burned below the soil surface. All the organic matter was consumed. There's very little charring other than what you see for those stumps. If there were trees on the site, there's characteristics of how much bark is left, how much how it killed the foliage, or if it removed it. But characteristics that you can go out and evaluate on a site that can help you say, well, this was really a low severity fire, so we probably had minimal mortality of some of our more desirable species on the site, or we might be looking at high mortality. I know some of the work that several have done, and some of the work John and I have done, Bates and I, we can go from less than 10% mortality to over 80% mortality of deep-rooted perennial grasses, depending on how severe the fire was. Another major component besides the plants, this is something that Jason Williams and Fred Pearson helped a lot on, were the section 4, and that gets down to soils. And we broke these subsections into soil temperatures, just how hot do these surface soils get, and how quickly does that dissipate as you get down to, say, a half inch or an inch or several inches below the soil surface. We looked at soil nutrients, the effects of fire, and the literature that documents, here's what happens to total nitrogen, and here's what happens to available nitrogen or carbon or phosphorus or potassium. And those are all broken out into individual sections. We go into more detail on biological crusts, and we also then get into the hydro and erosion. Just an example, I know there's a lot of questions that come in when we talk about burning or treatment, is what impact is it going to have on the carbon pool? And that's a real tough question to address, but there has been a handful of some really pretty good papers that help us address that question. I think our biggest limitation on that is in the literature is just we don't have enough work. But it's interesting that fire in the short term probably does have definitely a bigger impact on the above ground carbon pool than, I say, a mechanical treatment, such as you see in this picture. But in the long run, it may actually not have any difference, or could possibly actually add more carbon in the long term, safe carbon into the system, because one of the most persistent forms of carbon is charcoal or charred material. So if that gets incorporated into the soil, that's going to be a fairly long, persistent carbon source. Whereas things that lie above the soil usually are going to dissipate eventually over time into the atmosphere and not get into the soil. Section 5 kind of then does a summary and putting it back again into a framework, but it also lists a number of the assumptions that were made both when I was in the group I worked with that were doing in this literature review, and some just primary assumptions that I think believe that the literature nicely supports, is that, for example, you go up in elevation, it gets cooler, and your recovery ability of these sites is going to increases, and the resistance to invasives increases. And again, that will be modified by different factors, such as the soils what soil depths, key soil characteristics are going to be those factors, such as that influence soil water holding capacity and the availability to capture and storage of these to move them over. And what we're going to link this to is going to be a pocket field guide that will have a number of things that will tie the framework, and will lean heavily on this, that will help people just go out and determine, evaluate what the resilience and resistance of this site is likely to be, and based on what, and being able to justify why you might go with one treatment versus another. And of course, one of the key issues that we get into here is when we're treating particularly, say, juniper, is are you sure this is a site that was a sagebrush community and not a juniper site in the past, or is this an old growth site? And so there'll be a number, and definitely the table that talks about fire severity will be all things that will be in this pocket field guide to just kind of help people look at the landscape and determine where likely are the problems going to be with say cheatgrass or exotics, and then where are the problems less likely to be, and maybe where fire should work well, but where mechanical treatment might be better to apply on particular areas that weeds are going to be a concern. This also wraps up into the appendices. There's a couple of things, but we have a pretty decent, I think, glossary in the back that has been hot linked. So there's terms that you'll come across in the text that will be highlighted, and you can click on that term and it'll take you right to the glossary. And I think the value of this is particularly in writing any kind of EAs or documents, that it's important to make sure that the terms are being used consistently and properly. And the example I have here are fire intensity and fire severity that I see used interchangeably all the time, and yet they mean two very, very different things. Where fire intensity is just simply a release of energy, of how hot the fire got, how much energy was actually released, where fire severity is the term that for most of us are really concerned about, because that's the one that has what the ecological impacts on that site were. And there's no doubt they're linked. You'd think that intensity is going to have some influence on severity, which it will, but duration is also a real key component. So you could have a very slow burning, low intensity fire, such a duff layer, that could have high severity impacts on the soils directly beneath that site. And these are just some other examples of terms that sometimes there's a lot of overlap, but it gets confusing and they get used interchangeably, and they mean, but a phase, when we talk about ecological or state and transition models, we talk about steady states and phases. Well, how is phase different than a plant community? And or when we're talking about several stages or habitat types. And so it just basically helps to make it more consistent. And to wrap this presentation up, I would say possibly one of the greatest deficiencies that I came across in looking at through all this literature was the very limited amount of long-term information. That the majority of studies are less than 5 years, a lot of them are 3 years or less. So we don't have the long-term information, and just from looking at the response, we definitely can see that the first year can really tell us very little, and it's not till we get out to year 2 and 3 that we'll probably have a better handle on what the long-term trajectories are. Some of the long-term studies have substituted space for time, so what they did, and what we've done this too, is you go out and you look at, say, 10 different fires that have 10 different ages on them. But the concerns there are those fires, did they burn the same? Were the severity levels the same? Was the condition on the sites the same? And are those ecological sites the same? There was only really 2 papers that we could come across that used fire that looked at close to 20 years or more of what happened to these sites, and where they were done on the same sites, and they even had pre-burn. Here's what the sites looked like before fire. They had that information. And then Weston York's was one paper that went out 19 years in Utah, and then some of Blaisdell's early work that was summarized later by Harness and Murray that was in Idaho, that gives us kind of some long-term perspective. So definitely the long-term research has been severely lacking in our profession, unfortunately. But we do, I think, have some pretty good short-term information. So with that, I'd be willing to take any questions.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, please type them into your questions box.
Well, and Judy, you might want to say something about the availability of this.
Oh, yeah. So
yeah.
I apologize. I wanted to have this posted a few days before the webinar, but we just got it posted this morning. So the draft publication is now available on our website, and I provided the link on this webinar here. But if you also go to our Great Basin Fire Science Delivery website, you'll find it in the events section for this webinar, and I'll also post it in the synthesis section. And so we intend for the online document to be a living document, so we'll continue to update it as we have information. Whereas the published version will come out in sometime in early next year, and so then we'll have hard copies available for anyone who wants one. Did that cover it?
Yeah, I think it did.
Okay. So the first question is from Jan Ng. Has there been any interest in examining atmospheric particulate types levels as a site characteristic?
Oh, in terms of the amount that would be put out by if we were to do a prescribed burn. I'll interpret it that way, and if I don't have it correct, then hopefully Jan will rephrase the question. But I would say if there's, I'm assuming I'll restate the question, is that when we look at site characteristics, has there been any information looking at, well, how much particulate or smoke is there likely to be put out based on the biomass or this particular site? And I would say yes and no. I didn't come across anything that really specifically addresses any of the sites that we've done, but I do know the Fire Lab up in Missoula has been working, and there's several individuals that have been working on looking at the amount of above ground biomass, and this is more probably in forested systems, and how much particulate smoke based on the biomass, above ground biomass that those sites would likely put up. And of course, that's going to also vary by how hot the fire is. So a high severity fire is going to put out a lot more particulates and smoke. It'll consume more material than possibly a low severity fire, although it's not quite straight across the board, because from what I understand, sometimes if you get a long smoldering fire, that can add a lot of particulates, even though it's not a real hot fire, although it would be considered a high severity fire. So the conditions of the fire along with the biomass are two key components. And so about all we could do is if we had some estimates in our ecological site descriptions or in some papers that talk about the potential biomass that various ecological sites or plant associations or habitat types, whatever, would potentially have, and then you would have to tie that in with the conditions of the fire, you might be able to kind of estimate the amount of particulates that site would produce. But I didn't come across anything that looked at that in the Great Basin literature.
Okay, thanks. The Buffalo Field Office of the BLM asks, was there any research that looked at season of disturbance, especially with respect to seed banks and resulting effects?
There was, in terms of season of burn, there was some, and we do have pulled together in this document looking at, say, spring burning versus fall burning, and then even some hot summer burns, which is more like our prescribed, or say a wildfire. And what I found interesting with the spring versus fall is the information was not very clear in terms of, it didn't stand out saying, well, which one would be the better one to do. And of course, spring burning is difficult for us to do in the basin, but some of the results showed that there was beneficial results in terms of survivorship of some of the more desirable plants were higher with spring burning, but then it also showed that some of the studies showed that there was it had a greater impact on spring burning, and so it wasn't real clear. One great example with the mid-season burn that we look at, say, squirrel tail, which we think is one of our more resistant grasses to burning. And some work shows that it was extremely resilient and it produced lots of seed when it burned during the dormant season. But some of Wright's early work on squirrel tail showed that if they burned it when it was still green under hot fire conditions, and I believe this was under wildfire conditions, that it actually set the grasses back for the first year. In terms of seed output, it just, again, you're definitely going to be looking at fall burns would occur after many of the plants have produced seed, but unfortunately it doesn't occur after plants like sagebrush are still, the seed is still in the process of maturing the seed head when we do a lot of the fall burns, or when a larger burn or say a hot wildfire comes through an area. So we tried, there's not been a lot of spring and fall comparisons or season of burn. There's been some, and so what there is out there we tried to pull together, but unfortunately the answer was not real clear based on the results. The results were a bit inconsistent. Probably has a lot to do with the site characteristics and I imagine particularly the condition of the burn.
So more studies needed, I guess, huh?
Yeah.
So Richard Martinson asks, did you find a significant change in species composition post-fire?
The yes and no. In terms of the herbaceous layer, generally most of the deep-rooted perennial grasses persisted through unless it was a high-severity fire and there was some mortality. So the let me step back. The composition, I don't know, can you still see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me just, for example, let's just take a look at this photograph here. Pretty much the majority of the plants that you see, we see Indian rice grass, there's some basin walled rye, needle and thread, but a lot of Idaho fescue and some blue bunch on wheatgrass on that site. And this is the first year after the fire. And the composition is basically the plants you see on that site are the plants that were there prior to the burn. So the herbaceous component, and this is actually the same site, and this is the second year after the fire where these plants are starting to put out seed. The herbaceous layer definitely increased in the second and third year, but of course what we lost were the woody plants, and you don't see much in terms of there's some sagebrush skeletons out there. This site happened to be hit pretty heavily by a rogamoth before it was burned, and so most of the sagebrush on this site was dead. So you're definitely going to see a major decrease in the woody species if it's burned. The herbaceous layer is going to depend on what was there on the site. And I'll add that this is a cool, wet site. This site gets about 12 inches. It's right in the edge, about 12 inches of precip, maybe even a little less. But it has its soils. It has a high capturability and storage on these soils, so they make the most. It's actually, this particular soils has some pumice mixed in with kind of I guess it would probably be classed as a sandy loam. So in that case, we saw a real increase in the herbaceous, and then a loss of definitely of the woodies. Another example where we saw just the opposite happen is where this site here in 2007, that site was primarily Sandberg's bluegrass, and this is a relatively deep soil. So Sandberg's bluegrass should not have been the dominant grass on that site. It should have been probably blue bunch, and probably it would have been Thurber's needlegrass on this particular site. Where we saw the parts of this area, particularly on the more northerly aspects, had a good component of blue bunch wheatgrass, and we saw very little change in composition in terms of exotics moving in on that site. The blue bunch definitely increased, and we saw a decline in the juniper and sagebrush. But in the sites that were in poor condition and that had this, and you can see the 09, we had a huge increase in cheatgrass 2 years after. So the answer that is right most of the time if you ask that question, it's going to be it depends. But of course the key thing is what does it depend on? And again, I think the composition and the resilience ability of those sites has a lot to do with the that soil temperature moisture regimes. Are they on the warm side or cool side? And definitely what the composition of that site was prior to. In terms of the forb component, we see they get tough because there's a lower amount of them generally initially, and there's a lot of variability. But the general pattern is we see either no change or an increase in those forbs that are tolerant to fire, and oftentimes like a mat-forming forbs, such as some of the phloxes and pussy toes and fleabanes, and even some of the eriogonums will see a decrease. The one interesting thing in the literature that when we split that out with looking at perennial forbs, because there's a lot of interest, particularly with sage grouse, is that if we took the literature and I looked at all the literature in perennial forb response after fire on just the warm dry sites that got less than 12 inches of precip and they would have been mapped as mesic or warm, we saw no change. There was really no evidence of a decrease, but there was definitely no evidence to see an increase. If we looked at the papers that were done more, say, in the mountain big sagebrush communities who would have been mapped as frigid or cool, and they were closer to 12 inches or more precip, 70% of the research papers showed a significant increase in perennial forbs. So it definitely depends on the site conditions.
Rick, I just have a follow-up question too. In this top picture here, you said that it was a deep soil and it should have had blue bunch, but it had sandbergs. Do you know why that was?
That would have been past management, yeah, past management. And the site was very patchy, so sandbergs is definitely, should be a dominant grass in a community that has shallow soils, because sandbergs, that's what it does. It has a shallow root system. But
gotcha.
In a soil like this is actually site has primarily basin big sagebrush on it. And then this site here, your soils are about 3 feet deep. And so on that particular site, blue bunch wheatgrass. And we had, unfortunately I don't have it included here, but we had some gentle north aspects on this site. And the blue bunch was incredible in terms of it looked really great. You think, wow, this burn was successful. But if you came around, this aspect here was a little more of a kind of a westerly aspect, so that would be it'd be a little warmer than that north aspect. We're definitely down. We're below. This is in Oregon. We're below 4,000 feet in elevation, so these soils are mapped as mesic or warm, and but with the soil depth, blue bunch wheatgrass should have been the main factor here. This could have been a spot where I suspect it looked like, because it was near a road, there could have been some salting in this particular area, and so it was a congregation for livestock. But I'm sure it's, and just the way the topography is, I really think that it would have been overgrazing in this particular spot that shifted it over to sandbergs, which is a more resistant grass to grazing.
Okay, thanks. A follow-up to that previous question was, did seasonality of burning affect species richness?
I don't think we really have enough work that can really answer that question. And I'm trying to think, generally if fire is going to occur late in the season, most everything, the majority of vegetation is dormant, of course, except for the woody plants. Even if they're dormant, they're going to be susceptible unless they're sprouters, which we address that. I think I would bet you that if it had been studied, that probably would find, again, that it would be inconsistent, and it's going to depend a lot on the conditions of the fire, particularly these fall fires, where the fire is relatively cool, or were they hot? Very hot fires, particularly oftentimes our summer wildfires can be very hot, but the severity could be low because they could be fast-moving fires. And definitely, what's there, the tolerance of the species, and the severity and the kind of fire that you had is probably going to have a lot of effect on what it does to species richness.
Okay, thanks. And then a follow-up to the question, I'll just read it again. Was there any research that looked at season of disturbance, especially with respect to seed banks, and resulting effects. And the follow-up was, how about with respect to the existing seed bank in the soil?
Okay. What we found with the existing seed bank, first let me address what the impacts of fire tend to be on seed banks in the soil, and then we can see if we can tease out the season effect. Seed banks, and this generally some of the higher density component of seed banks tend to be directly underneath your shrubs or your tree canopies because they collect in the duff if they're wind disseminated. And particularly things like cheatgrass, the highest density of cheatgrass seed is usually going to be underneath the canopies of shrubs and trees. When you think about it, if a site burns, those are going to be oftentimes the hot spots. So a lot of that seed bank is consumed underneath those duff layers. And one early work that was kind of impressive by Jim Young in Nevada showed that cheatgrass seed, the seed pools were in the thousands per meter squared. So in other words, you had, or 10 feet, if you had a plot that was 10 feet square, prior to the burn, they were looking at in the thousands of seed, cheatgrass seed in that 10-foot square. In the first year after burning, they went out and they found that it dropped down to 10 seeds per that square 10-foot ring. And then the second year, it was up to 10,000 seeds per square meter. And so definitely any seed that's on the surface is going to be very susceptible to being consumed by fire. And again, it's going to depend a lot on the conditions of that fire. Is it slow moving? Is it fast moving? Sometimes you can get a burn that moves through so quick it actually barely, you can look at the litter, and the litter, if the litter's kind of charred but it's you can identify the litter yet, there probably quite a bit of seed would have survived on that site. But if the litter is pretty much all consumed and you can't identify it because it's nothing but ash or it's totally gone, then probably the majority of that seed was consumed on that site. Any seed that's buried within just a few meters, or a few millimeters below the surface, a high percentage that's very likely to, particularly in the inner space, will oftentimes survive the burn. The role of seed pools that we could find really did not, the literature would state, kind of support that at least for the herbaceous layer, the role of the seed pool was pretty minimal, that the response was so closely tied to the response of the vegetation that was there prior to the burn, and then the seed crops that occurred in the years following early after the fire. And again, I'm talking about the herbaceous component. However, with sagebrush, there is some evidence that would support that seed pool could be very important, particularly in large burns, because the sagebrush seed does not disseminate very far. So a fire is going to basically burn through an area, whether it's a wildfire or prescribed fire, prior to that year's seed crop being produced. So it's going to be dependent on residual seed crop from the previous year or maybe the year before that. So fire can have a huge impact on seed that's in the seed pool, particularly that stuff that's on the surface or laying in the duff layers beneath the weight plants. In terms of season of burn, I can't think of any work that actually looked at season of burn and what impact it had on the seed pool. But again, I think it's going to be dictated primarily by how severe that fire was and how much of the organic matter and litter layer did it consume on the surface. And you can bet that the higher percentage of litter that was consumed totally on the surface, you can think of that seed pool on the surface being just like litter, and that will be the same component. So if a spring burn means that you had very light burn going through an area, or versus say a real hot burn in midsummer versus a cooler prescribed burn, the amount of consumption of litter on the surface is probably going to be a real good indicator of what happened to the seed pool on the surface or in the duff. So hopefully that gets at the answer. But no study saying, well, we looked at spring burning, midsummer burning, and fall burning, and what impact did it have on the seed pool. I didn't come across anything that addressed that.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Stephen Gierick asks, due in large part to sage-grouse concerns, forb species are increasingly promoted in fire rehabilitation seedings. Based on the predicted increase of forbs that usually result following fire, is it sensible or cost-effective to include forb seed in fire rehabilitation seedings?
Well, the one thing that we really didn't address in this particular document, and which really could be a great topic for a follow-up publication, would be seeding. And and I know people like Dave Pike and Bruce Roundy definitely have done a lot of work in this particular area. But the success rate, with burning, one thing, if we address just before we get into seeding the sage-grouse, we did look at sage-grouse food forbs and what were the indications. And some papers showed an increase, some papers didn't show an increase. And kind of one of the scenarios that kind of comes out is in some of the work that we've done, that within the first couple of years we can get a significant increase in forbs that are found in the sage-grouse diet. But the majority of those are usually annuals, and native annuals, and then of course there's some exotic annuals that they will also consume. And so in that case, it's probably going to be a short-term response. There's been some work, and again, it can be pretty inconsistent depending on conditions, and in terms of some of the key forbs that some of the, like the Chicordia group, like the mountain dandelions, crepus, and a number of those, that there can be an increase following fire, but the variability is so high, it's often hard to capture that when we're doing research. So definitely that means that if the site is, I think the key thing on whether to seed or not to seed is if you know what was the abundance of key sage-grouse forbs on that site prior to burning. And then depending on their growth form, are they likely to increase or decrease? Unfortunately, a lot of these burns, particularly these big fires like the Holloway fire that was almost 500,000 acres in Nevada and Oregon this year, a lot of times we don't know what the condition of those sites were, but you could probably guess. Some of the higher elevation sites, I'd just been in that site, were really in nice condition, and the lower elevation sites look really pretty bad before the burn in terms of cheatgrass. And unfortunately, those sites would be the ones that are going to be tougher to successfully seed because they are drier. And so they have the lower resilience, they have the less resistance to invasives, and they're also harder to revegetate, so it just makes the job more difficult. And so I guess those would be key criteria. And in terms of success, I didn't get into the literature in terms of seeding success, but I know with the natives, seeding success, it's been pretty tough and probably inconsistent. Some real success stories and some things things just didn't happen, and that's just definitely something that should be followed up. I think would be another publication that could come out and really looking at, okay, here's the impacts, now let's look at restoration practices and what have been successes and failures and why. So sorry, Steve, I really can't give you a good answer.
All right. Well, that'll be our next subject that we try to address.
Yeah, I think, and it's a tough one because unfortunately, the easier sites to restore are usually the sites that are not as likely to need it as the sites that are very difficult to restore, usually in pretty bad shape.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Rick. That was the last question.
Okay, great. I'm getting off easy.
So I just want to let everyone know that a recording of this webinar will be sent to you automatically through the GoToWebinar system tomorrow, but I will also post it on the Great Basin Fire Science Delivery website within the next few weeks. And if you have more questions regarding this webinar or other topics, please email or call me at any time, and I'm sure Rick would be happy to answer questions too. So thank you very much, Rick, for your presentation today, and thank you all for your participation.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, have a good day, everyone. And Rick, do you have to run out anywhere, or can I call you really quickly?
No, why don't you call me real quick?
Okay, will do.
So you want me to hang up?
Yeah, I'll close down the webinar and then I'll call you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be here. I'm going to have lunch.
Okay, great. All right, thanks
Okay.
everyone.
Yeah, and I'll have lunch here, so I'll be here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
All right, bye.